Welcome back, Mark Doran. Thank you for being here. Today we are talking about our CARE campaign. So that is the Coalition for Responsible Energy, a group of organizations that's growing, looking to hold the AER responsible for its shortcomings in oil and gas liabilities. So in particular today, we're going to talk about Orphans, the Orphan Fund, etc. Our first action out of this group, we've got a three-pronged approach that we're going to walk through today. The first is we're going to educate citizens on what is the Orphan Fund and what is the shortcomings that we are experiencing right now. Then we want to take legal action by way of a regulatory appeal and call for legislative changes around the Orphan Fund itself. Let's start with, why are we running this campaign? This is the biggest issue in our country. So can you elaborate on that a bit for us, Mark?
Yes, well, the problem that the Orphan Fund has always been set up to address, and this is really, we're focusing on the Orphan Fund now, but the greater problem is what we call in Alberta unfunded upstream oil and gas liabilities. And what that really means is that there's been no security or no money set aside to cover what we call closure costs. The costs of plugging wells, cleaning up contaminated soil at well sites, and reclaiming those sites so that the sites can be given back to the landowner for future use for something other than oil and gas. What occurred in the past is that operators, which are oil and gas companies, for the most part at least, they said, well, to the regulator and the governments back in the 80s and 90s, when they first realized that perhaps oil companies could go bankrupt in the future. It was a bit unthinkable in those days. But they said, please don't make us pay security deposits, and please let us transfer our well licenses to whoever we want without much oversight. And in return, we will take care of those costs of closing wells, of closing facilities, of cleaning up the land, including contamination, for those of our industry members who fail. So that became legislated under Part 11 of what's called the Oil and Gas Conservation Act. That's the main licensing, oil and facility licensing statute in Alberta. So we now have something called the Orphan Fund. But you're right, it's potentially financially and perhaps environmentally the biggest problem in the country, in my view, because upstream oil and gas liabilities could be as high as $120 billion. And we're not counting oil sands here. We're just counting wells and facilities. That's enough. That's potentially about $25,000 per citizen. And that's only half the big problems. So the Orphan Fund is very important, because if we manage it properly, we're all not at risk to pay those costs. But if we mismanage it, we're all at risk. And that's what we're going to talk about. We are calling for a more responsible energy plus reform of the Alberta Energy Regulator, who's the main upstream oil and gas regulator. So I think that answers that question about why this is such a big problem financially, and also in terms of groundwater and air quality and other things. It's very important because these wells can leak harmful gases, etc., groundwater and stuff. So it's bigger than just a financial issue.
Right. Thank you for saying that, because I think a lot of people think about methane emissions alone, and they don't think about the water and land associated with this and the importance of these sites being cleaned up in order to manage all three of those things. We want to talk also about why we're doing this right now. So let's talk about the analysis that was done by David Yeager, Mature Asset Strategy. Can we just please highlight for people what the Alberta government just executed with some industry-friendly folks under Dave Yeager, please?
Well, I only have secondhand knowledge, but I have it from some landowner people that I know well. I represent landowners. I'm also an upstream oil and gas guy in the past. 3 or 4 landowners and a few municipalities were asked to participate in what I think was a heavily industry-weighted set of discussions, and this came out with the report was leaked. I think we wouldn't have known anything about it had some good people from industry not leaked this report out to the news media. But it's essentially a report from Mr. David Yeager to the Premier or Cabinet. The Premier's commented on it, and I don't think that what's in the report matches the Premier's comments at all. The industry's wish list in this Mature Asset Strategy report is all designed to be an end run around the current statutory scheme where the center of it for landowner protection and for citizen protection is the orphan fund. So it's an end run around the orphan fund. It's going to be expensive for these industry members to pay for orphans, which means to close the facilities and wells of those companies who've gone bankrupt is going to cost the rest of industry a lot of money. That's what they asked for in the past. Now that it's time to pay the piper and the bill's getting big, they want to wiggle out of their responsibility. And I'm going to put it this way. The orphan fund has always protected us as citizens and as landowners. It's time for us to now protect the orphan fund because it's under major attack from industry, and through this mature asset report of Mr. Yeager's is clearly an attack on the orphan fund.
Thank you for elaborating on that. And I just want to add too that the other thing that's happening right now is that oil prices have declined significantly recently. So they're just around $60 oil. In Alberta, because we do have lower grade oil, our assets are not necessarily economic at this level. So we can expect this orphan fund to grow right now. So it's at a critical point that we address this, because as you've highlighted in the past for me, so far Canadians have only dished out $1.7 billion towards closure. That's across all 3 provinces. Alberta was $1 billion during COVID, and that's it. The rest of this needs to be understood that this is industry's responsibility. And as Mark was saying, it is primarily the large companies that are holding the bag here. And so we have to uphold this law. Okay, so let's get into it.
That brings up an important point I didn't say about it, Mass. In the report, they complain about the low cost of natural gas, which ties right into your oil. So oil prices have been decent, but the cost of natural gas, which is what's produced by a huge number of our wells, is in the tank. It's only about $2 per 1,000 cubic feet or something, this is what the operators complained about. So part of the mature asset strategy appears to be trying to increase the price of natural gas, which is the big pressures from these natural gas producers that were going broke even despite the price of oil. So I think that's a really important point.
Yes, thank you. It's both oil and gas pressures that we should be expecting. In fact, Long Run is more of a natural gas player, and their assets are about to land in the orphan fund. Okay, let's describe an orphan, please. This is a really important discussion. Help everybody understand, what is an orphan well or facility? How do assets become orphan?
Yes, well, we don't have a definition of orphan in our law. It's missing, glaring problem, but simply put, we're using the regular definition. An orphan is a person without a parent, and similarly in oil and gas, an orphan well or facility covered under Part 11 of the licensing statute is a well or a facility associated with wells where the licensee or the company that's legally responsible for that site or that well bore no longer exists. They've either absconded from the province, which happens, but it's rare, but more often they've gone bankrupt. They don't exist anymore because they failed financially. And so the Alberta Energy Regulator designates wells or facilities as orphans. And when they are designated, then from that point on, they can receive funds from the orphan fund to facilitate their closure if there's no other company involved in the minerals of that well to pay their portion of the closure cost. Closure means plugging the well, cleaning up any contamination on the soil on the site, or restoring the site back to its original condition or close to it. That's called reclamation. So well plugging, decontamination of sites, and restoration of sites are the 3 main areas of closure costs that would come out of the orphan fund.
Right. It's funny because I was speaking with somebody recently and realizing in Alberta, we actually are very unique in that we know all the history of Alberta. As you and I have discussed, there's many provinces and states that they don't know the ownership. Alberta has very good records. In fact, we can trace back to the original owners. So it's actually interesting that we call it an orphan fund, because the name of the companies is still quite clear. We know where they're coming from and we know who owns it. So let's talk a little bit about the orphan fund. Can you explain how the ownership of the orphan fund is divvied?
It's up to the Alberta Energy Regulator. So what we're going to talk about now ties in with our litigation portion of our 3-pronged campaign. So the Alberta Energy Regulator is the sole body charged with determining an annual levy. So a levy is an amount that industry members all must pay to cover the costs of closure of orphans. There's three factors that the regulator must consider in setting this annual amount. The first one is estimated closure costs for those wells or facilities that have been named as orphans by the regulator. The second one is any shortfall of operations from the previous year, and that amount is right on the Alberta Energy Regulator's website. It's massive, so they're not considering the second. Those two are mandatory factors, and then the third one's a discretionary factor. It's any contingency, if you will, that the AR might want to put in for emergencies. We have this formula that the AR must follow by law to calculate the levy, and they're not following it. They alone are supposed to determine this, and we know from Freedom of Information requests in the past that they've been asking the Orphan Well Association, I'll come to that, is tasked with actually managing the closure of these sites. They've asked them, what's your budget? Or they've asked industry member associations what they're willing to pay. They've stopped doing that in recent years, but now they're just seeking government approval, and government has no power, no jurisdiction. They're not supposed to interfere here. This is an arm's length regulator. They're making two main errors of law in determining this annual levy amount that industry has to pay. The first is that, so they have announced the latest levy. It's $145.45 million for the next year, announced in March. The shortfall of operations on their own website from last year is $862 million. So that means we should be in the $1 billion range minimum, and we're only down in 0.14 billion, if you will. So we're about 15% perhaps of what it should be right now. So what we're going to do is we're going to ask for two-part review, asking for Alberta Energy Regulator hearing commissioners to review that decision, the most recent decision and the last few decisions, because they're made pursuant to errors of law. So we can do that through what's called a regulatory appeal, where hearing commissioners of the Alberta Energy Regulator would consider that question, or what's called reconsideration, which is another way of asking for review. You can only get a regulatory appeal within 30 days of the decision being made, and the decision was made on March 31st for the most recent levy. So we're going to ask them to review those decisions and to make them according to law, which they're not doing. And if they refuse to do that, or if they have a hearing and don't do it properly as required by law, then we would appeal that decision to the Court of Appeal of Alberta. So that's the litigation component of our three-pronged plan. The big risk associated with the litigation prong of our campaign here is that the Alberta Energy Regulator may not accept this application. It should accept this application. So I think we're going to try to bring some public pressure to bear on the regulator to make sure that that actually happens, Jenny, because that's critical.
Right. So yes, we're going to have we're going to do a public announcement when this happens. We're going to want people out there to make sure that they see that this application has gone in.
I think we should just back up and say that they have what they call liability management, which are policies at the AR. You know them, used to work in that area. But if those policies fail, that's what the orphan fund's for. It's like the backstop or the safety net. And then the Orphan Well Association, who is tasked with actually doing the work, they hire contractors, but they call the orphan fund a backstop. So if we're playing a game, the backstops for citizens protection, very similar. The mature asset strategy in industry, they're trying to tear holes in this backstop. The regulator is as well, by not funding the levy enough. We're gonna say, please patch up these holes in this backstop, and let's keep this backstop well maintained forever until the last company fails. Because under the orphan fund, only when the last company fails, we need to have no more oil and gas companies, only then should citizens start paying for closure costs. So very important.
So we have this orphan fund. It was put in place by industry. The percentage of the orphan fund is funded based on the percent liability that companies hold. So for example, C4RE holds about 23% of Alberta's liabilities. Therefore, they pay about 23% of the orphan fund, by way of example. That's true for all the majors. They are the largest holders of the orphan fund just based on their percent ownership of the patch. So that's how it works. And this fund, as you were saying, is not being adequately funded. There's evidence of that on the AER's website themselves, saying that they're almost $1 billion short of what that fund should be. You and I both know that there are orphans coming. We've got Long Run that's about to go under. We've got a few others that I know that are on the brink. That's going to double the orphan fund. So it's a very important time for us to be identifying this and be making sure that the law is clear and being upheld. So we are going to apply for this appeal and a reconsideration at the same time. If it's denied, we're going to take it to the Court of Appeal. So there's a couple of options for us there to make sure that we are holding the regulator accountable and not letting industry or the government decide what this fund is. This is laws for a reason. We have to uphold these laws. A little bit further to that, Mark, is we're also looking at some legislative changes. So can you speak a little bit about Section 36, what it means and what we want to do there, please?
Yeah, well, Section 36 means Section 36 of the Surface Rights Act. And the Surface Rights Act is the law that governs use of land by operators, including oil and gas operators, but beyond oil and gas operators that don't actually own the land, that the surface of the land that they're operating on. So they're going to operate on land that's owned by someone else. So I'll call those host landowners. And so under the Surface Rights Act, which is unique to Alberta, even our neighboring provinces don't have this particular feature, is that if an operator owes any amount to a landowner, what's called now the Land and Property Rights Tribunal, formerly called the Surface Rights Board, they act as a collection agency for the landowner. So they would order the operator to pay. And if the operator doesn't pay, they order the Minister of Environment to pay the landowner out of general revenue. So we're going to ask for a change in this, and I'll come back to that. But here's the problem. If orphan fund's underfunded, we've got lots of orphans that aren't being retired properly. The landowners get paid by the taxpayer every year for up to decades or a decade and a half or more until the orphan fund actually gets a reclamation certificate. So the person that we're going to be using is the orphan landowner on this. He's already been paid for 8 years by the taxpayers of Alberta before his well was even named an orphan. It's a Sequoia well. So now it's just been named an orphan, and they're telling him 10, 12, 15 years minimum before they get a reclamation certificate. So we're talking about going on 20 years. If we were deciding the levy properly, these sites would get retired in probably 5 or 6 or 7 years as opposed to 20. The cost to taxpayers, according to the Surface Rights Board recently in numerous landowner meetings, is $35 million per year, rapidly growing. Now we know that only a fraction of landowners actually know that they can collect from the government in this fashion. So if all landowners were seeking what their due is, it would be quite higher. So the change we're proposing is to change the Section 36 of the Surface Rights Act and Part 11 of the Oil and Gas Conservation Act, where these landowners get paid from the orphan fund instead of by the taxpayer. That's true polluter pay or industry pay. And this would actually incent, in my view, so if industry is paying higher orphan fund levies, they're going to want to get these sites cleaned up, closed, so they can stop paying those landowners. That's a big part of the incentive. So I think that that's the weak spot in the law. To sum up, we want to educate on what this fund is, how it's your protection. You need to protect it. The way to do that is to make sure that the AR is properly deciding the levy amount each year. And if we have the fund expanded to cover landowner expenses, the taxpayer is completely and totally protected and indemnified, which is how it should be, because these operators asked for this in the first place. They asked for lax rules. They promised they would fund the orphan fund in return. They need to do it. It's not unfair. This is our protection. And your alternative is to shell out the $25,000 for yourself, your husband or wife, your children, other people in your family. I don't think anybody wants to do that.
Absolutely not.
I don't think I can sum it up any more concisely than that. And so we have this beautiful thing, the envy of the world, in my view. Americans have nothing like this. Americans will have to pay for these closure costs because their legislators didn't come up with anything like the Orphan Fund. It also has another benefit. It's really hard to decide how much security to make each company. What it's going to cost to close each well or site is variable. The Orphan Fund negates all that. We don't,
You're right.
industry pays the cost no matter what it is. And that's why it's the ultimate backstop. So let's just be clear that it's up to the AR and industry to make sure the correct party pays. But if they fail to make sure the correct party pays, then industry as a whole needs to pay under our current laws. Let's keep it that way.
Excellent. We're educating people through this. We're taking legal action by carrying out both an appeal and a reconsideration of the orphan levy. And then we're looking for legislative changes. You mentioned Section 36. We've also talked about the orphan language not being very clear. So this process will help us get better language in the orphan program to ensure that it is adequately funded and forward-looking. We need to make sure that we're considering what is coming, not just what's in the books. And I'm just going to reiterate the reasons why this is so important right now. We're talking about an estimated $120 to $130 billion problem. This orphan fund and levy is not covering what's currently in the orphan fund and certainly not looking forward. The Alberta government has carried out a review that is clearly seeking to upend the orphan fund. It's clearly trying to make us be the backstop rather than industry. And lastly, oil prices, natural gas prices are low. We must consider this right now and make sure that we're standing up for our rights.
We need to stress that CARE is going to be looking into issues beyond the Orphan Fund. This is just the first one, and we're pretty much largely focused on two things: responsible energy development, and most importantly, the key aspect of that is reform of the Alberta Energy Regulator. This is just one example of many where this regulator is failing to carry out its a critically important mandate as required by law. We need to have regulation. We can't let any industry, let alone oil and gas, that's dangerous and has all these liabilities, run unchecked. That's what regulation and what the regulators are for. We need to make sure this regulator, which is the biggest regulator in the country, is properly doing its job. And we decided to start with just this one aspect of it, but there are many more, and watch for CARE's future activities.
Right. Great. Thank you for that. And also get involved. We want more members. So if you're listening to this and you want to join the effort, please do. The CARE Coalition is looking for more members. So thank you very much.